All right, so the topic that I'm presenting on today is I'm all ears. How does untrained listeners' perception of a mix differ from that of studio professionals? We'll look at the general overview and the development of the idea. I'll go over my creation process of my stimuli, as well as play a short excerpt from all of them. And then after that, I'll go through my participant interviews and the main results that I got from them. So you might be asking, why untrained listeners? And what does that mean? The criteria that I used for what would qualify someone as an untrained listener was that they didn't have any audio training and little to no musical training. Most of the participants did turn out to have a little bit of musical training, but it was either many years old or had only been for a short amount of time. Further developing on the idea, what does other research show about untrained listeners? In a study designed to assess untrained listeners' ability to assess bass audio quality, it was determined that a listener's ability to assess audio quality is almost entirely unaffected by their level of expertise. And that's from Fidenza and Wilson 2016. We also ask, is the perception of experts actually the same as the perception of average consumers? From the same study, there suggests an answer, saying the main difference may not be the perception per se, but rather the fact that experts develop a reference system from experience with preceding listening tests, and they have a better idea of which audio quality should correspond to which rating. All right, it's that idea that led me to some of my research questions. I ask, how does the use of these specific music production techniques affect listeners' preference of one mix over another? Is a listener able to pick out or identify these techniques? And if so, what language do they use to describe them? And I wonder if the genre preference of a listener affects their level of understanding of music production techniques. And coming back to the main title, overall, how does the perception of untrained listeners differ that of trained listeners? And I'm also inclined to ask whether we as audio engineers should adapt our approach based on what untrained listeners perceive. So for developing my stimuli, I had two different tracks, a rock track and a hip hop track. Each track had both a mixed version and an unmixed version. The unmixed version was essentially a bounce right from the recording session, only with the levels that I'd set during recording. The mixed version was mixed in my own style and how I felt was appropriate for the genre of each song. Both of the songs were recorded, mixed, and produced by myself. And a lot of my mixing practice came from my reading Mixing with Impact, as well as some of the philosophy offered in the book had an impact on my overall goals. I documented my mixing process, but I won't go into that in here. So this is my rock track. I recorded with this awesome local band, Biloxi Parish. Some of you may remember them performing at AES Fest back in January. I have about 30 seconds of all of the songs, but I had about 2 minutes for each of them during the actual interviews. All right, so I'll go ahead here. I'll play the mixed one first.
Oh, cousin, all of the light has disappeared, and I reckon I have the devil in me, the devil in me.
All right, and now I'll play the unmixed version. And so we'll move on to the next track, my hip hop track, recorded with Ken here in Lethbridge. Bonjour, Ken, I know you're listening. And it also featured the track, Tyrone helped me do the track for that, which is awesome. Ken wrote the vocals for it, as well as played this instrument here you can see on the screen, the balafon, which I personally think was a very cool addition to the track. And so I'll go ahead and play the mixed version again here first. All right, and then I'll play the unmixed version here. That was actually kind of interesting hearing all of those versions. I haven't listened to them on headphones in quite a while. I've only heard them played through the speakers in Studio One as I did during the interview, so that was kind of interesting hearing that again for the first time. So to go into the participant interviews and kind of how I ran them, I had 10 participants total. They came into Studio One to do the interviews, which were recorded and then I transcribed. Each interview started with a quick survey for demographic questions, including things like their personal genre preferences. I gave everyone a brief introduction to what they should listen for and an overview on the concept of mixing. Basically just trying to say, listen for things beyond the performance of the instruments. And I basically said that mixing was making choices to help elements fit together in a song. These are just some of the questions that I asked participants. Every time I asked this first question on their first listen, I asked, what are your initial impressions after hearing these two versions for the first time? And then after that, they were allowed to go back and re-listen. Other questions I asked are whether or not they preferred one version, what they thought about the impact of the elements, and how they would classify the genre. The answers to the genre question vary quite widely on what I've been calling the hip-hop track. It is a little bit vague. It being in another language also threw some people off. A number of people thought that it was Punjabi or Indian somehow, but I got answers like people called it pop, synth, indie, electronic, different stuff like that. All right, so now to take a look at the results in the trends in the data. First of all, yes, untrained listeners do in fact show a propensity for perceiving differences in mixes. To return back to this idea from Bielefeld, I don't know how to say that name, 2013, now with some context. The main difference may not be the perception per se, but rather the fact that experts develop a reference system from experience with preceding listening tests. They have a better idea of which audio quality should correspond to which rating. The main difference between trained and untrained listeners is this reference system, or lack thereof, and the sophistication of the vocabulary at their disposal. And to answer a question I had going in, participants that said they listened to hip hop and related genres didn't actually seem to show any extra inclination to understanding audio production like I thought they perhaps might. People's preferences for which mix they liked better was one of the most surprising results to me. In the first couple of interviews, when I had people say that they prefer what I knew to be the mixed version, I was quite surprised. In my head, the low levels of the vocals in the unmixed version of the rock track is something unforgivable and completely rules out the viability of the mix. Starting to challenge this idea is part of the reason why I'm doing this research. As you can see for both songs, it was a fairly even split for which version listeners preferred. There was 4 people preferred the mixed for the rock, 2 had no preference, and 4 liked the unmixed. And then for the hip hop track, it was an even 5-5 split. Listeners that prefer the unmixed version of the rock track cited reasons like disliking the style and the tone of the vocalist, and because this version had less of that, they preferred it. The preference for the mixed version was largely due to being able to understand the lyrics. Just a note here that some listeners had multiple reasons for why they had their preference, so the number of reasons exceeds the number of people who had that preference. For the hip hop track, there was an even split between the preference for the versions, and an interesting result here shows that one participant said that they preferred the mixed version because it had less beat, whereas there were 2 participants said that they preferred the unmixed version because of the stronger beat. This just supports the idea that listening and mixing is personal and subjective, and which is a recurring theme throughout my research. Here are just some of the things that came up the most, kind of were trends there. One of the main things that participants cited was that being able to hear and understand the lyrics in the mixed version of the rock track had a strong effect on the emotional impact of the song. 4 different participants likened the vocals of the mixed version to a live performance or karaoke, or like they were added in separately of the instruments. Even if a participant gave a preference of one over the other, while there were 2 participants said that they had no preference for mixed or unmixed for the rock track, there was a general idea that a split the difference type thing would be ideal for the balance between the vocals and the instruments. In hindsight, I would have liked to have raised the volume of the vocals in the unmixed version a little bit. I think the difference was just a little bit too drastic. So then a couple of trends for the hip hop track included 4 participants noting that they heard significantly less differences between the 2 versions than they did for the other song. And just for a note on this, because I had randomized orders, only about half the participants actually heard the hip hop track second, and those are the people that made this observation. And then this next one can be considered kind of more of a personal musical preference, but some participants cited the bridge section in this song as either taking them out of the song or they just didn't enjoy it. All right, to conclude, mixing is subjective, even for the most experienced professionals. These results show that among this small sample of people, there is no strong pull either way to liking one or more over the other. Perhaps the main difference between trained and untrained listeners is the vocabulary they have at their disposal. Participants often used vocalizations to describe elements of songs in lieu of adjectives that we have, like punchy, bright, or warm. When, to my surprise, participants started saying they preferred an unmixed version, I was quick to write that off in my head. But just because it's not what I think is right doesn't mean it's wrong. And continuing to factor this idea into my own mixing practices can only help me grow. And overall, we as mixers, and myself as an audio engineer, will continue to learn and adapt. And I'll just leave you with this quote here from Mixing with Impact, as it was the main guide I used for making my mixing choices in this process. He says, "Mixing is not the same as making music. It is the art of translating music from separate components into a coherent whole. These components will hopefully contain the soul of the music, which you try to communicate to the listener. You're telling the story of music with the sound that's available to you. Mixing is not an autonomous art form. Without musical ideas, arrangement, recording, and production, there would be nothing to communicate. And just to add on to that, learning to open up our ears to what the audience has to say, the people that we're ultimately communicating to, can only help us enhance our ability to mix meaningfully." Thank you.
Amazing, very good. Okay, so questions, comments? Please jump in. I'm sure that raised some questions, this talk.
I have one question. I was wondering, because I know in our Tonmeister class, we've talked a little bit about mixing and editing being kind of an artistic practice. And here you talked a lot about the kind of subjective qualities that mixing had in people's perception. So do you think that there's a link between mixing as an artistic practice and the research that you did?
Most definitely. I think that to expand our art form and our understanding of the art form, taking into account, ultimately we mix music to be distributed to consumers, to the audience. And so if we need to take into account what that ultimate audience thinks. because we basically follow rules that are made by us for us and don't necessarily take into account what outsiders might perceive.
Right, so not even just an artistic practice, but even like a commercial practice in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, great question. Anybody else? We can take one more question. I see a bunch of people are giving you some good comments on the chat, but yeah, if somebody has maybe a comment, one of our guests. Well, I have a question then. So after doing this research, how are you going to mix differently?
I think I'm going to, when people were saying that they preferred the unmixed version, my initial response just in my head was kind of like, no, I worked so hard on this other track. Why are you thinking that this other one that I think doesn't sound right is better? And I think more than anything, I'm just going to take the idea that there isn't one right way to do things. Like, I'm not going to be doing something wrong by changing what I've taught has been the right way to do something. Experiment a little more with it.
Okay, well, that's great. Yeah, amazing.